Hey guys, this is Joe with the Adapt team. In this video, we are doing Adapt AV in System Manager. When we left our last video, we wanted to make sure that our program compiled clean. No warnings, no errors, no notices. This is really going to help us in the debugging process. If something were to go wrong, God forbid, we can eliminate that it's not a signal that's not connected or something like that with our clean compile. So now we're actually ready to load our program. We've actually built this ability to load programs right into System Manager, and we follow Crestron's recommended procedure for doing so, where we transfer the LPZ file into the program 1 folder on my processor or whatever program slot we're loading to, and then firing the prog load command, and we're going to see that happen in just a second. It's going to become very important to watch our boot up sequence in console. Sometimes I may have modules that I've made a mistake on in my Simple Windows program, and we're going to get an indication if that were the case in our boot up sequence. And ultimately we just want to make sure that our program boots up correctly. It's always kind of good practice, so we watch our boot up sequence in console. So let me real quick go ahead and get my load started for us. You can see us do that here in System Manager. I am in fact already connected to my processor. You can see down here I'm connected via SSH on port 22 here. And if we go to our tools section in System Manager, you can file transfer your control program, where System Manager lets you browse, and here we are looking for our LPZ that we compiled. So we'll go ahead and click on that. In this case, I've elected to send the SIG file as well to eliminate me from needing this SIG file on my machine to debug it. And so I'll go ahead and hit send to control system. Like I said, we do follow Crestron's recommended procedure here. First, we're going to stop our existing running program, whatever program is running on our processor. We're going to file transfer that LPZ file. You'll see that in a sec. And then we will send the prog load command after all this is done. Typically, again, like I said, I would want to watch this process in console. You can see it kind of going on here. Here we just sent that prog load command a few seconds ago. Instead of watching us, watching this boot up procedure in real time, I've actually just got a slide that's got a couple things I want to talk about as well. So the first thing that happens in our boot up procedure, actually it's not even on this slide, is that you'll see our big Adapt logo, and that means that our Adapt core has kind of initialized, has kind of started up. And the first real thing that happens is the program checks to see if there is an Adapt file in NVRAM on the processor. And of course there's either going to be a file or there's not. If there is a file, we want to also make sure, is it the correct file? If it is the correct file, meaning that this is an existing system, I already have an Adapt file for this system and I want to continue using it, so obviously yes, it is the correct file, and the boot up procedure continues using that file. If it's an incorrect file, we want to ignore that file, but we want to keep it as a backup just so that we don't accidentally delete a config if this was a mistake. But ultimately what it's going to do is create a new file with the name that we specified in our boot up module. And that's really how the program is determining if it's the correct file, is based on the name that we defined in our boot up module in Simple Windows. And ultimately, if there's no file that exists, obviously we need to create a new configuration file. After this kind of file checking has taken place, we then go into our startup delay. The purpose of the startup delay is to wait for the processor to stabilize. We don't have control over certain things like update requests and how third-party modules initialize, and a couple other things that the processor is doing under the hood. So we want to give the processor some time to process all those things before our Adapt boot up sequence commences. And then the next thing that happens is we go, after our startup delay, is we see this data event. And this is where, for new Adapt files, we're going to create this configuration data based on all of our Adapt Simple Windows modules. So based on all the modules that we had in our program, create that corresponding data in our Adapt file. And then if it is an existing file, if this is an existing system, we're going to compare the modules that exist in my Simple Windows program and compare that to the existing configuration data and update the file if needed. We'll see this come into play when we start to add things to our system, right? If I wanted to add a TV or add additional rooms, this is the procedure we're going to go through, this comparison. All right, so we can check in on our program boot ups process so far, and starting at the very top, we can see, yes, here's our big Adapt logo. So we started our boot up. The first thing that it did, like I mentioned on the slide, is it checked for our Adapt file. And remember that the name of this Adapt file is based on our boot up module, that very last module in our entire program. So there's the name of our Adapt file that it's going to look for right there. And in this case, our Adapt file did not exist, and so it went ahead and created a brand new one right here. Went into our startup delay, which I described. We initialized our simple plus modules so that our system can fire this data event and make that comparison between what's in the program and what needs to be written to the Adapt file. We fire a bunch of setup events for other devices in the system, and at the very end, we see this total time. And when we see that total time, or this demo mode banner here, that indicates that our program is ready to use. It's good to go. Now, this program has not been activated yet. This is the first time I'm loading it, of course. So we are currently in demo mode, and this program is letting us know that the system will stop functioning properly 1 hour from now. And that's okay. We should be able to get most of this done within that 1 hour. So I've got this brand new Adapt file that we want to start to configure. Let me go over to System Manager, the main window here, and I'm going to open my Adapt file from my processor, right? And so let's do that. Here's my Adapt file here. Go ahead and pull that down. And here now I'm on my Devices tab, and this is where I can start to see all of the devices according to the Simple Windows modules that exist in my system, right? So I actually did program in 2 6x100s, a 8x8, a couple AVRs, and 8 displays. Of course, all my sources are here with, more importantly, the source numbers that I selected, right? So now it's very clear to me what sources are what. And so when I have this fresh Adapt file, this empty Adapt file, there's a couple kind of things that I recommend that you do. Number one is to start at the top and work your way down, just like we did in Simple Windows. And number two is, help yourself out most effectively by labeling everything that you possibly can. So we'll actually start by labeling our inputs and outputs on our C2N amps here. So let's go ahead and think about our sources, how these are going to be laid out. Might as well just lay these out in order. So it's going to be these 7 sources that need to go on my C2N amp. So I'll just go in order: DirecTV, TiVo, Apple TV, Roku. And we've built this really nice feature into System Manager that when I'm typing in a field like this, I hit enter to kind of commit that change, if you will, or really just move on to the next line. But then if I hit enter again, now I'm immediately ready to type into my next text box. So this makes it really easy to just go through my entire list here and type through everything. Kscape. Now I do want to mention that these are just labels, right? These are kind of like applying a piece of label tape to the inputs or to the back of your hardware here. This does not yet indicate that this source is actually plugged in here, or that we're telling the system that these sources are plugged in on these inputs, but this is rather just labeling this input so I know where to land these for next time. And so I could also go ahead and label the outputs. Maybe let's give us some room names here: living room, master bed, master bath, maybe kitchen, patio, maybe guest room. And then let's go ahead and just say that we are going to send zone 7 to the theater, which is going to be our line level output to our theater AVR. And so that'll satisfy our first 6x100. Now I kind of added this second 6x100 to demonstrate a couple things, but one of the things that I can demonstrate here is this ability to copy and paste here in System Manager. When I copy switcher 1, I can paste certain things about that switcher onto other switchers. So for example, I could paste input names, which it would make sense in a case like this, right? If I have cascaded kind of 6x100s, the input numbers are most likely going to be the same, and so that input copy paste has really helped me out. Now outputs doesn't really make sense to copy and paste, right? Because there's not going to be any zones that share these outputs, but of course maybe there could be, and so we've given you that ability just in case. So now I've labeled my inputs, and again, the important thing about this is just like applying a piece of label tape to your C2N amp saying, hey, this is DirecTV. All right, let's go down to video switchers, and we can kind of do the same thing, right? We're just going to say DirecTV, TiVo, Apple TV, Roku, Kscape, and again, these are just labeling the inputs. Here I'm going to start with my theater this time, or maybe I should start with my living room like I did before. Master bed, master bath, kitchen, patio, guest room, and then I'll go ahead and line up output 7 for that theater as well. And you can start to see that when we are labeling things, it can really help us out if things are kind of in the same order all over the place, right? So what I mean by this is why I had all my video sources first, so that these can occupy the first 5 or so inputs on both my audio switcher and my video switcher, and everything is nice and kind of cohesive. And even the outputs of my 8x8 match my C2N amp exactly, and so that's really going to help me stay consistent later on. Alright, so still moving from top to bottom here, my next device type is receivers, and I'm actually just now realizing that I did not actually touch receivers in my program at all, but that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and use this first receiver anyway, so let me go ahead and fill this in. This is going to be the theater receiver. This next one is going to be unused, and so we're going to remove this from our system a little bit later, and I'll show you how to do that. To actually control this receiver, we want to let the system know if this is an IR or kind of a one-way communicating device, or if this is not IR and we're communicating with this device over 232 and we have access to things like direct set volume. Now this receiver, I'm just going to arbitrarily pick this to be something like a Denon receiver. This happens to be one of the most popular ones that we see, and also the protocol is very nice. Here I have our adapt command string spreadsheet open, which you can again find a link to on our forum, and you can see that Denon is one of the receivers that we have in here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to punch in these strings that I kind of know by heart already. That's how much I do these things. And what we're going to see is that when this receiver is told to turn on and off or mute or one of these inputs, whatever, we're going to see this receiver, or I should say we're going to see adapt send these strings down that command TX signal in simple windows. Now one of the things that I'm going to do here as well is I'm going to have all my video sources at my lower input numbers, like 1 and 2. So here is going to be kind of my DM input, if you will, where my DM is going to come into this theater zone. And then I'm going to have the Blu-ray input on this Denon be where that local Blu-ray comes in. And then I'm going to have actually a game input as well for that Xbox. And then I'm going to have some separation, and then I'm going to use the CD left-right input for my line level input coming in from my audio switcher. And we'll see this prioritization or this kind of ordering of your sources is going to come in handy a little bit later. Of course, for volume, again, our Denon strings, they kind of look like this, right? Where if we want to send MV and then a volume level and then a carriage return, well, the header is just MV, the footer is just \x0d, and we are looking for a 2-digit number between 0 and 99, and that is all per Denon specification. And so that's our theater receiver. Now for displays and receivers, we also have control over the timing of these receivers, right? So we can dictate to the system, well, how long does this device take to turn on before we can fire input commands, and how long after an input command do we have to wait before we can send it additional commands, and how long does it take to turn off before we can tell it to turn back on. If for some reason you do need a delay before off, so essentially user pushes the off button and you want to wait some delay before telling this device to turn off, you can optionally do that here. And then we also have a pulse length field. This is how long will the digital signals in Simple Windows coming off of your Adapt module, how long will those digitals pulse for? So if they are connected to, say, an IR driver in Simple Windows, this is your IR pulse length right here. All right, and so that's our theater receiver. Moving right along, now we have all of our displays. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and name all of these displays. We have that similar shortcut that we talked about before when we're labeling things, where if I hit enter once, I move down to the next line, hit enter again, and now I'm ready to type. So I'll do that here. Master bath, kitchen, patio, guest room, theater. And display 8 will be unused. Sometimes it can be nice to have unused devices left in your system in case your client does add that 8th TV. It actually already is hooked up in our program, and we just would need to configure it. All right. So now we've labeled all of our TVs. We could go through and label the inputs, since most of these are only going to be using input 1. I don't think it's necessary to label all of these. But then let's go in and let's specify how we're going to control all of these TVs. Let's go back to that same commands field. Now, if I wanted to, certainly I could control these over, dynamic IR. And to select my IR file, I want to show you where all of our provided dynamic IR files are. I'm in my Adapt Suite folder here. If we go to examples, dynamic IR files, you can see some that we've provided for you here. So of course I could select from any one of these. Might as well just pick a Sony. While we're here, I want to show you how we can copy and paste certain things about this display, or what I'm electing to do, just paste everything. So the commands, the timing, and the names. Let's say if we were controlling, instead of IR Sony, maybe we were doing Sony over 232. Again, remember that we are set up to do that already in our program because we connected all of our display modules to our DM RMCs. And so all I need to do is just from our spreadsheet, just copy and paste all of these commands in here. Now, in this particular case, I actually only care about turning these TVs on and off, and maybe an input. Let's go ahead and add an input command to make sure that it's on the correct input. I'm not planning on doing volume control on any of these, and so I don't care about volume down here, right? Volume for all of these zones, for all of the sources, is going to be through my overhead speakers, with the exception of the theater, which of course is going to be through my AVR. And so again, all I care about here is turning this display on and off and selecting its first input. Let's just go ahead and do a couple others, so we can do maybe a Samsung in here. Maybe my let's see, input 1 here. Maybe my patio TV is a Sunbright. That makes sense, right? I like these nice, easy commands. Very easy to punch in here. My guest room, gosh, maybe we're controlling the guest room CEC because it's a Best Buy kind of TV, perhaps, that has CEC built in. You may have to play with CEC input commands. Some TVs are nice and easy to set up, but others are not. You will have to do some experimentation there. And my theater is my last one. Let's go ahead and pick maybe an Epson projector here. So let's do power on and power off. And we're going to assume my projector doesn't switch inputs, especially because we don't have the input command. So we would want to find that if input was necessary, but I think we're good for now. And so that's all of my displays. Maybe I want to affect the timing so that it's a 20-second kind of warm-up period and a 30-second cool-down period on this projector. That'll, of course, the system will understand that there is a warm-up and cool-down time, and it will not try to send commands during that warm-up or cool-down time. All right, so our next device is going to be sources. Sources, you can see most of them are already named, and so I'm just going to slightly adjust them to get rid of these numbers in here since I don't need these. Just so you know, the numbers that you see here are based on the source number that we gave to these modules in Simple Windows. So these are 11 and 12 because that's what the source number that we gave them. This one I'm going to go ahead and just leave as Blu-ray. This one I'm going to go ahead and name as Xbox. So now I've named my sources, and to be clear, the names that you see for these sources right here are the global source names, right? So I changed this source name right here, and this will change the name of this source globally in the system. The next thing I like to do is go to settings and talk about icons. We can easily search for icons by just typing in on our keyboard. Makes it nice and easy to do that. Add all of our icons here. We do use the Neo theme by default, and so that's what all of these icons are from the Neo Crestron theme. Neo is of course a Crestron theme, and so it is compatible with other Crestron themes. And so if you do switch themes to, you know, a Black Glass or Simplice or whatever the case may be, these icons will change on your user interface to reflect to that updated theme. Alright, so just going through and iconing everything here. And so this is finally where we now get to start to tell the system where these sources are plugged in. The default kind of operation for Adapt is that all of our switching devices can only have one source plugged into an input at any time. And of course this physically kind of makes sense, right? An input can only have one cable plugged into it, and when we're talking about a source, that means that only one source can go to one input. And so that's how we're going to start to think about landing these sources. And by the way, we call this output destinations. This is where our source output has its destination, so we call it source output destinations. So what I like to go through and do first is all my audio destinations. I want to tell the system where all my audio in my system lands. To do that, we just hit this plus button over here on the right to add an audio destination. And we want to go and we want to select the switcher that we want to tell the program that this source is connected to. You can see we have both of our switchers right here, and I can just simply double click on DirecTV, and now the system understands that this DirecTV is plugged into input 1. If I was actually utilizing this C2N amp, of course I could now have a second audio destination. So now the system understands that it's landed on both of these inputs on two different switchers, and so that's why it's okay to have multiple destinations, is because these are on multiple different switchers. And so we want to go through and do that for all of our sources here. I'm not going to add that second switcher anymore since we're not actually using it, but of course you could if you were. So I'll go through and add all my audio destinations here. Hopefully you can see this is where my idea of kind of keeping everything in order really comes in handy, because this is, oops, that's the wrong one there. So everything is kept in nice order, and I understand where everything is laid out, everything's labeled, everything is very easy. Now these Blu-ray and Xbox sources, these are just connected via HDMI, so they do not have a discrete audio route like the rest of these sources do. And so now that we're done with all of our audio destinations, we want to go through and add our video destinations. Okay, so we'll go through video. You can see video can land on any one of these types of devices, right? It can land on your video switcher, it can land on a receiver, a display, or even directly into a multi-window processor. And so here we're going to land all of our video sources on our video switcher, all of our distributed sources at least on our video switcher. Obviously these music sources do not have a video destination. We could make them video sources if we did want to maybe use the HDMI out of an Autonomic. You could certainly make that a video destination if you wanted to. But going down to these Blu-ray and Xbox sources, these are of course going to land on our theater receiver, input 2. I thought we named these anyway, input 2 and input 3. And actually I remember now we did not label these, although we should. So let's do this: SAT, cable, BD, game, and this one will be our CD input. And so now hopefully we should see, yeah, you see that when I update the name back on our receiver page, it did in fact update the name here as well. So it's very nice. And so now the system understands where all my sources are plugged in. Now, one of the things that I said is that the way Adapt kind of starts thinking about sources is that one input can contain one source, right? A source, say a DirecTV box, plugs in via HDMI to DM output 1, and there's no other sources that can be available on input 1. Well, this ends up not being the case in some circumstances, right? And in fact, in the case of most of our TVs, this is not the case. There's not just a single source that's on input 1 or a single source that's available on input 1. In fact, there's many sources. Say in any one of my rooms, you might have 5 sources available on any one input of, you know, a TV or an AVR. And so the way that we account for this is with something that we call tie lines. So if we take a look real quick at this living room, what we want to do is we want to say, well, sure, there isn't any single source that's available on input 1, but what there is there's a tie line to a video switcher output for my living room. And this is going to tell the system that now any of the sources that are available to my DM chassis, and specifically output 1 of this chassis, any sources that are available on that output are now also available on this input 1 right here. And so that's going to become very important when we talk about what we call a source map. It's essentially what sources are available on which input of every device in our system. Well, now the system understands that there are in fact 5 video sources available on this one single input. And so when the living room gets told to go to source number 3, the living room TV is going to look up in its source map and say, oh, okay, source 3 is available on input 1, so I should turn the living room TV on and I should turn it to input 1. And so we can, of course, continue these tie lines on down the line here. Of course, if we were using a different input other than input 1, we would just land this tie line on that input instead. Okay. And then the only thing I want to do now is make sure that this AV receiver is set up correctly. And in fact, I just realized this theater input, the DM does not go directly into this theater projector. Instead, what goes into this theater projector is my theater receiver's output. And in fact, this right here is the only functional difference between a receiver and a display in Adapt, is the fact that a receiver has an output right here that we oftentimes use as this tie line. And the reason that this receiver is important to have here as this tie line is because, of course, the receiver has these local sources on it. And so if I had simply tied a DM output here, the theater projector would not know what to do when it's told to, you know, go look at this Blu-ray or Xbox source. And so, of course, since my theater receiver tie line is here on my theater projector, I want to make sure that my DM tie line is in fact specified right here on my theater receiver, since I do in fact have DM coming in on this input. Of course, the system already knows that my Blu-ray is on input 2 and my game is on input 3. But what it also wants to know about is, you know, which output of my audio switcher am I getting my audio feed from? So this is now an audio tie line where I can tie output 7 of my C2N amp, which is my line level out, right? And tie that to input 10. So now my user has the ability to listen to music in this theater room, and the system understands it needs to not only control output 7, but it also needs to flip this receiver to the CD input, okay? So I think that about does it for most of the devices in my system. I now want to move over to my Rooms tab, and this is where I start to think about the rooms that are in my system. The first thing I notice is that I actually only have one room in my system, at least that's available to configure here. And of course, the reason that I only have this one room is because I only have one room module here that's currently compiling in my Simple Windows program. And so what I'm going to do just real quick is I'm actually going to add some additional rooms using my paste special, and I'm going to start compiling that in just a sec, and so it'll be ready for us to load. before we do that, let's go ahead and play around with this living room a little bit. Let's first, I guess, name it living room, right? And then we can go and we can start to add the C2 and amp zone for that living room. And we can also add the living room TV for that room. And since we only have one room, we can still test with this system a little bit. Just won't be very, won't have very many rooms in it, I suppose, but it won't help us, or won't stop us from at least testing this living room. And so the last thing I'm going to do before I load this is I'm actually going to go to my iPad, since that's what I'm going to use to test this system. And I'm going to switch our home page to our home page 12 here so that it is ready to use, and we will go ahead and send in our adapt file. Now, our adapt file is so small compared to even our 26 room example that notice our update process only takes about 3 seconds here, and we've now updated our system. Always a good practice to watch in console like I am here, because right here the system is telling me that I have not yet placed these Sony Dynamic IR drivers into that IR drivers directory. System Manager can take care of that for me by going to Tools and then sending my Dynamic IR files, and then I will update my system again quickly here, and hopefully we should see those files get loaded properly. And sure enough, there we go. So now I'm actually kind of ready to test this system. I could test this system in a couple ways. I think the way that maybe makes the most sense is to start actually with a handheld remote. What I want to do with a handheld remote is define some of these custom buttons to get sources active in this room. So let me go ahead and just map some of my sources here. We will go ahead and talk more about all of our various user interfaces a little bit later. For now, I'm just going to focus on this. And this is just where I'm assigning sources to the buttons on my HR150, and I'll send that in. And to actually start to test this out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Debugger, and we're going to verify that what I think should be happening to my system is in fact actually happening. Okay, so my system is back. Should be looking for SIG file. There it is. And here's what I'm going to do is I am going to go to, first I'm going to uncheck all my touch panel signals so that I don't get spammed by that, and I'm also going to uncheck my MLX3 signals. And if I go to my handheld, so I just got done configuring handheld 1, what should happen when I hit custom button 1 is it should be throwing DirecTV to the living room. And then the living room knows that it has this living room TV and this living room audio zone, and so it's going to tell the living room TV and the living room audio zone, go to DirecTV. The audio switcher knows that DirecTV is on input 1, and the TV knows that it has its tie line from DM on input 1, and so both of those devices should turn on and go to their respective input 1s. So let's see that happen here. So let's hit custom 1. We see here that this packet transmission is my TV's dynamic IR command getting fired, most likely a power on command right here. We went ahead and routed our video through DM, and in fact we matched our audio as well, so that's all input 1. And then we turned on our audio switcher onto input 1 as well. So as far as I can see, everything appears to be working properly. And then about 10 seconds or so after we sent our TV's power on command, you see these signals down here. This is what I'm guessing to be our TV's input command. And there is this 10-second delay in here because of course that's the 10-second timing that we had configured in System Manager. If I, let's say do volume up here, we should see my audio ramping, and of course it is. Volume down, we should see that ramping, and it is. Let's see if we have mute. There's my mute on and mute off. Now of course I don't actually have this audio switcher hooked up to my system right now, and so I'm not getting any feedback, but of course you would expect to see feedback signals on every single one of these if you did. If I am now tapping source control buttons, you see that my source 1 packet transmission goes high and low with my press and release. You can see this long string like you see right here is essentially my my press function, and as soon as I release, you see the release string go through. And so this does support, you know, that press and hold type of control as well. So let's quickly go through these sources. Let's go to custom 2. So the only thing I expect to happen for source 2 is my audio video route should be input 2, and we do actually repropagate your TV's input command, which is what this is right here. So we made sure that that TVU is on input 1. If I was to control this source, now you should see source 2 packet transmissions going out. Okay. And if we do custom 3, we see input 3 is firing, we see our TV input command, and we see our source controls for source 3 now. Custom 4, we're now going to input 4 everywhere, and our source controls are going to source 4. Source 5 is our autonomic source, and so by default what we do is we leave the TV on. Oh, excuse me, it's not autonomic, it's our Kscape, and so actually, so what I should have expected there is input 5 everywhere. That's exactly what happened. Input 6, excuse me, is our autonomic source, and so we are going to leave the TV on by default. Some of our clients prefer to watch one thing but listen to another thing, and so Adapt supports that. You know, by default is that we leave the TV on while you are now on your autonomic source. And again, you see that the only thing that we've done is we've just simply routed audio to the correct input here. Our music 2, all we do is we route that new input. And of course, now when we've turned off the zone, let's hit our power button. We make sure to shut off the audio switcher in the room, and we make sure to turn off the TV in the room. So now everything in that room would have turned off. Alright, so hopefully you can see that we do in fact have a, you know, somewhat functioning system at this point. Everything is kind of switching like we would expect, but obviously we still have a couple things to touch on here. I will go ahead and end this video right here, and in the next video we're going to be wrapping up this program. So we'll see you guys back there.